Okay, let's get started. Because obviously the last lesson is an important revision lesson. We've had a little bit of a revision task. It's not as much as I would have liked. However, we've had to do 2 assessment tasks in what is effectively for Year 11s, kind of pretty close to a 6-week term. So it's a challenge. And if you feel you're a little bit behind after that challenge, then that's not unreasonable. For Year 11s, it's a chance to think and reflect. 12s, we had a little bit more time, but I still think it's going to be a reasonably challenging assessment task. Let's consider the way I want you to write. I've given you this case about a negligent situation. The council build a new set of swings at North Lakes. There's a contractor involved. That brings in this idea of vicarious liability. These are legal issues that are coming out. The council's clearly outlined the specifications and they've been followed. Dan, 35-year-old, has run up, playing with his kid, has run up and jumped on the swing. The swing set only has a capacity of 75 kilos. Dan's fallen and hurt himself, hurt his back. And he can't work for a year and he can no longer play the bagpipes, right? Which I suspect Dan's neighbours would be very happy about that. And that he recovers completely. What are the legal issues that are involved in this? What are the answers that we can come with? I want to just go back and have a look at this ILAC principle, this structure. The first thing is to start, what are the important facts of the case? What's the information? Can I remind you, you will not have to remember this. Don't go and memorise ILAC. It's given to you in the exam question. It reminds you that structure. You don't have to memorise it. What's the information? What's the legal issues? Okay, for example, you might say, Dan looks like he's been a bit of an idiot, and therefore contributory negligence is going to be an issue. Vicarious liability is. And then you might go through the stages of negligence. Has that actually happened? Then you've got the arguments. What arguments exist? And you'll bring in some precedent cases. I gave Laura, I didn't give them to you, but I gave everyone else two cases that I have referred to in my answer. I'll give you a copy of those before you go. They're not the cases you'll get in the exam. You will get precedent cases in the exam. If you're going to memorise a few cases, think about ones that might be relevant to the big picture stuff. For example, the big question of is a duty of care. Maybe you'll learn that Stevenson Donoghue case and say, what does that show about who a duty of care is owed to? And then a conclusions. Why the damages are there that you're going to do, why you feel that your case is strong, that your advice is the correct that will lead to the outcome that you've anticipated. They're the 4 stages. So looking at my answer, is there anyone who thinks overall that my answer is unsatisfactory, has missed something significant? You might disagree with it, but does anyone think it's unsatisfactory? Okay. Anyone think that if I were to say, I think it's probably around a B, how many people think that is a reasonable assessment of that answer? Okay. Where do you guys think? How many people think it's an A-level answer?
I've just got a question.
Yeah.
Do you know how you've actually said like information and then you've written it? Are you supposed to do that in the letter or are you supposed to do it?
No, you would probably take those subheadings out. Okay, you would take the subheadings out in the lecture. Okay, and I think I put a little note saying it's going to be lecture style. Yeah. So where do you grade it? How many people? No one said it's going to be a D. How many people think it's a C-level letter? C plus, B minus, that sort of level. Okay. Anyone think it's higher than that? B plus? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think it's. I would have said somewhere around the B level is right. So no one's more than a grade away from that, which is pretty nice. Keep in mind with this, something I keep in mind when I mark, is this was done. I did mine in about 40 minutes at the end of class. You guys have got 90 minutes. Or whatever it is. I will be checking times. I think I'm going to give you a little bit more than what's written on your exam timetable. You're going to have about 90 minutes. That means I expect less in the task than I would otherwise. So maybe if you compared it with an assignment, maybe if it was an assignment I might say B minus because, for example, I haven't referred to any cases I think other than the ones that I've been given. That could have improved it. I referred to a couple of pieces of legislation. That's not too bad. I might think that in an assignment situation I can improve it more. Yeah, Rishka.
Stuff about the bagpipes and things like that.
Yeah.
It's like damages. Do we have to have that like
I'm going to look at some more things around calculations of damages today. And that is a good way to have a conclusion. I think that was one of the reasonable elements. I had a clearly specified idea. What I will, however, be doing is giving you some more detail on that this lesson. Right? Another way of doing it, a more precise way. And in fact, I think an A-level element of the answer will come out of that, John.
Are we allowed to type it up again?
Yes, you will be allowed to type it up. Yes, you will be allowed to type it up. Thank you for that question. Okay, let's have a look at my answer, just to see if there's anything here, like with the content, that we've missed or we haven't. Okay, I said the key facts. So format as a letter, right? My Dear Dan letter. Just have a look at that introduction. No one's going to get you points for. There are no marks associated for how nice the introduction flows. Just make sure it's that you're responding to Dan and his request for advice. That's all I ask there. Now we go down to the information facts. You can see how I've narrowed that down to one paragraph. That's really important because concise is one of the skills we're looking for in legal studies. So I said key facts are new set of swings were built by the Lakes. Dan ran up and jumped on those swings. The swings broke, losing a year's worth of income and the ability to play bagpipes. Those are the damages. The swing was only built to hold a person with a weight of 75 kilograms. Everything else I said was largely unimportant. Largely unimportant.
Just put the distance you jumped from.
You could have. Yeah, you could have. Absolutely. That may be part of argument. Is anyone add any other information they thought was particularly important? Particularly crucial? So you're happy, roughly happy with my summary?
Well, I think you probably should have mentioned how how it isn't mentioned anywhere in the text, because I'm just going to assume.
Yep.
That, they should have like say put up a sign saying.
Okay. Here's an interesting thing: is can we go beyond the facts? All right. If I've pulled the facts out, they're the important things. So I would be careful assuming too much there. Okay. If there had been a sign warning, that would have been a really important point of information. So your assumption is not unreasonable. I would tend to have just stuck to the facts.
Yeah, but it's not reasonably foreseeable to think that an adult is going to run and jump.
Okay, these are arguments that come later on. You do not have to come, my answer is not correct or incorrect. Okay, my answer is not correct or incorrect, but it just links to the law, and these are the conclusions I've made from the facts. Right, so you don't feel if you've argued something different, you're going to get something wrong. Farishka.
You should add in the contractor also.
Okay, there is the point of vicarious liability, which I have addressed later on, is important. And maybe one sentence statement says the contractor, swings and stuff, built this to specifications that were supplied and checked by the council. That is a reasonable extra statement. Yep.
Yeah, I put that a council inspector signed off on the finished.
That's-
like to
yep.
show that it was.
Because that's putting you up to say, okay, who are we going to sue in this situation? That is decisions, it swings and stuff for the council. Be pretty clear it's going to be the council, I think. I don't think anyone would argue that it is swings and stuff. Okay, the law. We've said the big picture issue is negligence. Has the Lakes Council been negligent? And look, I didn't mention it was the Lakes Council. It is a council matter that you deal with in your exam, and I have mentioned which council it is that comes there, okay? But if you call it Brisbane City Council or you call it Logan Council or it wouldn't matter. Okay. And has the Lakes College been negative in the way they've constructed the swings? That probably should be a question mark there, just quietly. That'd be better. 3 things have to be shown. The first is the duty of care. I've gone through these things. In this case, 2 other issues are really important. So I've also then brought in this idea of also negligence, swings of stuff, which Varushka led us to. And the second is where there's a level of contributory negligence from your decision to run up to the swing and jump on it. Okay, so that means that you've done something that doesn't make a lot of sense. And are you part of the problem? I've then dealt with vicarious liability and explained why I've ruled that out. Does anyone now, looking at those issues of law, does anyone have any concerns about that? Something there that does not look familiar to them? Something they're worried about applying to a case? Were there any other areas of law that you guys suggested should have been involved here? Yep.
Well, I think you should have mentioned how a reasonable person would have acted.
Okay, a reasonable person I think is important, and I think it comes in the arguments, but if you mention it there, that is fine too. Okay, that's a really important standard. What is the reasonable person, what precautions would a reasonable person have taken in this situation. And this is where it does become a difficult thing. And this is where I think a lot of you are going to disagree or have a different view of my conclusions, okay, because you're going to feel that Dan was behaving in a way that a reasonable person didn't have to take mention of. However, I do also point that I think I gave quite an interesting, one of the stimulus precedents was quite an interesting one, in that beach one particularly, right? Okay. Actually, I meant then the Woolworths one, the stuff on the floor where they hadn't been cleaning every 20 minutes. Very, very interesting. They weren't sure that these things caused it, but they still said better precautions should have been taken. That's what I came to hear. Let's think about the arguments. I've broken it up into the three things that have to be proven. Notice the first one where a duty of care is pretty clear that the council owes a duty of care to someone using the beach. I haven't gone into details about that. Right? We don't want to waste words on something that isn't going to build a sophisticated argument. I have, however, used this case of Swain versus Waverley Municipal Council to say, okay, hey, if this shows a council owes a duty of care to someone swimming at a beach, then surely they owe a duty of care to someone at a park. I've used that to make that link. There's a nice use of a precedent there. And something like that, I think, is above a C level of thinking. A very clear, careful use of a precedent. Okay? Nicely done, if I do say so myself. The last issue of that is of damages. Right? And then there's no case that damages have been caused. Whether a duty of care was breached is going to be the big question. But I've still been very succinct in the two areas where it's pretty clear. There's no question that he hurt himself from this and the damage has been caused. So now we get to be excited about the more difficult element. Has there been a breach of a duty of care? And this comes to the 75 kilogram thing, 75 kilogram weight. This would appear to be the Negligent Act, in my opinion, on the council's part. It is reasonably foreseeable that the swings will be used by people more than 75 kilos in weight. We see people playing on swings with their kids all the time. Indeed, as more and more adults are obese, and often adults play on the swings, it's a reasonable assumption that council should have swings that would have had this capacity. The consequences of harm and adult breaking a swing that only holds 75 kilograms is absolutely foreseeable, in my opinion. The important precedent in this matter from the High Court is the case Strong v Woolworths, where a person fell on bark chips at a shopping centre. The key reason for the decision was that reasonable care required inspections of the floor, even though this may not have prevented the accident. That's really important. This case in the High Court said that this may not have prevented the accident. There should have been a reasonable level of care, though, taken. In this case, I think it is very, very similar. That if a reasonable level of care had been taken, we don't know that it would have prevented the accident, but a reasonable level of care had not been taken. So that was the conclusion that I drew. How many people are comfortable? How many people can see that link between the case and that conclusion? Anyone who doesn't wants me to go into more detail of that? Yep, okay. We're looking at the subtleties here. Most of you guys, I take it, have got some concern over whether Dan was an idiot, right? That's the big thing. We're trying to say, is there something that we can use, because we're on Dan's side, effectively. We're giving Dan advice. We don't want to make up advice, but we want to see the situation as favourably as we can from his perspective. There was this case, Strong versus Woolworths, and basically Strong claimed she had fallen on some bark chippings that were outside the store that had not been regularly cleaned. Now, the judge in making his judgment said that they couldn't have been sure that these bark clippings actually caused the damage. However, he still found Woolworths responsible because they had not done everything they could. They had not taken reasonable care by inspecting and regularly cleaning that part of the floor. They had not taken reasonable care. And so in the same way, I'm saying the council has not taken reasonable care because they have not got a seat with a capacity that's reasonable for the people who they could see using the park. Does that link make a little bit of sense to you now?
Yeah, that's also with that sand case, because they wouldn't know if there was a sand out there.
That is true too, right? Yeah, the council didn't have, so you could have made that link as well. Yeah, very nice. Now, I'm not saying you have to argue this way at all. Okay, I'm just saying this is what I've used. You may argue a different way. Then we've gone on to, here's the next point. I've said there's little doubt that North Lakes Council will argue that your actions of running onto the swing contributed to the action known as contributory negligence. And I could have probably gone into some more details there, but I know I've addressed it further on. So that's the third lot, and the arguments. Can people see some of the arguments there now that I've made? Why does defamation? Why some of those things fall in place? Nothing is necessarily black and white. For example, I'm pretty sure I mentioned vicarious liability in the previous section. I could have easily mentioned it in that section, but either way, I'm building an argument. Now, the last part of it, the ILAC should have been conclusion, right? So I've called it damages because that's what I've dealt with. And here we go. Damages. You've missed 1 year of work. Your income is 80 grand. The Civil Liberty Act 2003. So nice job by me by getting an act in there. And I hope you can pick a few acts involved. Yep.
How do you know what his income is? If it's not on the paper?
Oh, wasn't it on the paper?
No.
Oh, okay, I've made a mistake there. Right. And so you would have referred to it as 1 year's worth of income. Okay, you would have referred to it as 1 year's worth of income.
I
John.
was just confused about the bit after because it says he got, like, the maximum we can get is 3 times.
Your average income?
Yeah, and that's 80,000 per year, but then he gets 80,000 anyway.
Okay, so in the answer, in the question, I have missed out putting in something here, and this is my mistake. I should have put in here, he earns $80,000 a year. Right. So that should have been in, so that's where that figure came from. You would have just said that he should have been awarded 1 year's worth of income there, right? You wouldn't have had a specific figure.
So it's not 3 times.
That is the maximum. So it limits the amount you can get to that. So if he had been, let's say he had been, working as a mining contractor earning $300,000 a year, you're not able to claim that amount of money because it's beyond that 3 times maximum. Okay, so that's the limit. That's the highest point.
3 times the average.
The average. That's right. 3 times the average income. And that's calculated by the Bureau of Statistics. It's around about $75,000 a year at the moment. So no one can get paid these economic losses of more than $210,000 a year. So even if you're earning $500,000 a year and you're out of work for 5 years, you can't get $2.5 million as lost income. It's capped at 3 times the average wage. You can only get about $1 million of lost income. Okay. It's a quirky little thing. However, it is some information that I think is well beyond a C standard that has been brought in and has been applied here. Okay. In this case, I've ruled out it says not important, but I've quoted an act and I've used that information, so I'm pretty happy about that. Also talked about the being unable to play the bagpipes, right? This is a source of damage for him because associated with pain and loss, we've got that enjoyment of life is one of those issues. And his enjoyment of life has been damaged because he can no longer play the bagpipes. Now, all those people who live around them, their enjoyment of life has probably gone up because they no longer have to listen to Dan playing the bagpipes, but we don't take that into account. Right? Dan the bagpiper, he has lost some enjoyment of his life. But I've had to say, we're going to look a little bit more at this scale, the maximum you can get is $250,000. That's what we've learned. The $250,000 increases by inflation each year, so a few years later it's now around about $300,000. But that's the maximum. That's if someone is like a quadriplegic or got serious brain damage. That's the maximum. Playing the bagpipes is nowhere near that maximum. Yep.
Wouldn't that argument be they can play with the sun as much?
I did say that was the only level of damages. Now, if I had said that he can't play with the sun, that would bring in a second level of damages as well. Yep.
Can a family sue on behalf of someone who's
Not capable of bringing a case themselves?
Like in a coma?
Yes. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And that happens. there's a word I just slipped my mind at the moment. That happens too when you are a minor and you're suing. Is it a tutor that has to bring the case? It's an unusual word, but someone has to bring on your behalf that case. Okay, so we've looked at that, and I've said that it's not a big deal. On the big scale, it's not up at the $250,000 level, it's the $50,000. Again, that's an important piece of reasoning there. I'm showing that I have thought through and I've come to a conclusion, and I've justified my conclusion based on the fact that from severe disability down to nothing, not being able to play the bagpipes is closer to nothing than anything. Now, the one part I think I could have argued better is accepting this. I've said we've accepted there's an element of contributory negligence in your situation because you've used a swing in a way that's different from how it's meant to be used. The question of damage is considered. The issue of causality is important. Would the damages have occurred but for reasonable action taken? In this case, there's no suggestion you fell off the swing by running and jumping into it. The swing broke because it did not have the capacity to cope with a reasonable adult's weight. And foreseeability, we can see observe people using equipment in the way. So we insist that you have provided about a 30% contribution to the situation. You could argue anything else, but that's what I've argued. I've given the reasons why and come to that conclusion. So I said the 130 damages goes down to 91. And then I've put some things in here that we haven't looked at, but I've popped in your email. The Limitation of Action Act 1974. You're going to be talking about damages, so this is another great act to take into account. The Limitation of Damages Act, and that says you've got 3 years to bring a case where there is an injury. Lara, yep?
In the exam, when we have to do this,
Yep.
do we have to argue in favour of the person who's
No.
injured, or can I argue on behalf of
You
the
can-
person they're trying to...
You can, yes, you can argue on behalf of everyone. My personal bias, Lara, is that it's probably easier to argue from the perspective of the person who is likely to take the action. My bias is, but if you look at it and say the question is worded that you can choose whichever party involved in the case you want to argue. Now, there's two parties that are associated with vicarious liability. I don't think you can get a whole essay out of that. Okay, if you just say they acted in a reasonable way and really it's the council who's responsible for the damage, it's going to be hard to turn that one sentence into 600 or 800 words. My feeling is you want to think of it probably from the council or the person's perspective. Yeah, and then I think you've got different things. The other thing you're more than welcome to do, you can advise Dan he's got nothing, he's going nowhere. Right? You can advise Dan that you don't think that he is going to. You don't think that the duty of care was breached.
Well, that's what I said in this.
Yeah, and if you think that the duty of care was not breached and there were no damages and you've got strong cases. Now, the hard thing is I would have a quick look at the precedent cases before you do that too, because I do want you to use those and they're going to lead you. In my opinion, these precedent cases led there to being the suggestion there was a duty of care. The council at Beach had a duty of care and had breached in a fairly similar way. Woolworths, very minor, and they said it may not have even caused, it may not have caused the accident, but they hadn't provided that reasonable standard of care. So you have a look at those cases too, Jesse.
How did you come up with 30%? Is that like a
That was like an estimate.
way of doing that? Or did you
No,
just
there's
guess?
no precise way of doing that. You're still assuming there the majority fault lies with the fact that there was a swing. And if you want to put this in a circumstance, if you say, okay, that swing had a capacity of 150 kilograms, Dan's not hurt. Right? Dan is only hurt because that swing broke.
Yeah.
Right? So that would be how I would argue that as being the lesser contribution to the situation. Okay. So any questions on that from conclusions? Now you don't have to have concluded the same way, but you do have to have brought everything together. One nice thing, Lara, just being, and for everyone, being like smart as a student about it, if you do argue that there are owed damages, even if you were to say that the council is only 10% responsible, you do have that nice ability to show some reasoning in your calculations, to explain and apply the law to a situation. Right, so that's like for the year 12s, that's your evaluating type mark. You're asking about that, Abby. So you've gone past investigating, that's like evaluating, and I think that's quite strong, quite a strong way to get it. Next thing I want to do today, I'm sorry, it looks a little bit boring, but what I've done is, I've gone through, do you have a question, Jason?
Oh no, I thought you were going to change it. I was like, okay, change it for a second.
No. What I've done this morning, and I have photocopied the original textbook, which is not important, it's only important. Gail, I've got a copy for you of the chapter from the original textbook. For everyone else, I've gone through and I'm using that as a little bit of summary, so these different perspectives. And I imagine in your study you're going to read through that chapter you've got. I've given you, the handouts I've given you have been from that other textbook, right, that no one in the room but John and me have got. This one is now the publicly available textbook, right, the non-special persons textbook. And I just want to use this as a little bit of an example, as a way of summarising what we've done. Can I just go back and ask, are there any questions on that task now, concerns? Yep?
It's just a really quick question. So,
Yep.
in total, Dan would have claimed for his income loss? and
Income
the
loss.
contributory negligence.
Then, yeah, he's claimed income loss and he's claimed the loss of enjoyment of life around not being able to play bagpipes, and then it's discounted by the fact that he's contributed to
So
it.
it's those two added together?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's my judgment of the situation. Who thought that Dan should not get anything at all? Lara and Josie, okay, you thought that there was not a duty of care, and I take it you guys argue there's not a duty of care to a guy who is not using the swings in the proper way and is running up
I
and
just said
jumping on them.
it's not reasonably foreseeable to think that an
Adult would jump
would
and
jump
run
on
at
a
it.
Yep.
children's swing.
Okay, I think that's a strong argument. Can I also put in that case, here's another sophisticated argument you may or may not have made. Remember, there's in the first lot of things, so there's a duty of care owed. One of the things that says there, is it like just and fair for a duty of care to be imposed? So here's a question, is it just and fair that a duty of care is, through this decision of the court, responsible for all people who misuse equipment that's not really meant for them on councils or not? Okay, and that's a really interesting question that you could have gone into, and I think would have helped with the sophistication of that. Josie, yep.
With the limitations of action as management court thing,
Yep.
and that I only have 3 years to do it.
Yep.
It says that because the negligence code requires proof of damage.
Yep.
So, if in Dan's case, like how he only missed the 1 year off of work because of his back,
Yep.
after 3 years or in the 3rd year, can he still claim for like it, even though he doesn't have that back damage anymore?
Yes, he can. Yes, he's got 3 years in which to bring the case, regardless of whether he's recovered in that time or not, or regardless of whether he has not recovered in that time too. If he doesn't get that act together, the other little bit in there that I put that I think takes it beyond a C level, in my hope, is I've talked about it being heard in the magistrate's court as a civil matter, and I've given a little bit of details of that. So that's knowledge from outside that's been drawn in to give a broader base of knowledge. Abby.
You said that this was a B level response.
Yep.
So to push it up to an A, what would you suggest being?
Okay, things I think we need to get up to an A. Another case or two from outside what's been given. Maybe more reference to a legislation. And I think a really in-depth analysis of one issue. And the one issue that I think I would have gone into a little bit more detail if I had the time was contributory negligence. And then lastly, I'm going to give you the scales of how damage is awarded. I want to go quickly through these notes in 10 minutes. I do not want you to write these down. I just want to use them as a revision tool, okay, to make sure that they are familiar with us. Remember, I'll email these to you guys so you get a copy of them. I'm recording this. I'll put it up on YouTube so you guys can see this as well. So this is going through what the second textbook has to say, and you'll see there's a lot of overlap. But what I am keen is anything you don't understand, you ask a question. John?
Please repeat
Things to get up to an A?
yes.
Legislation, so maybe another element of legislation integrated.
Yeah.
Another case or two from outside just the precedents. A greater discussion of one area, maybe contributory negligence, right? Some real in-depth discussion around one issue. And I think a discussion around a scale of damages. Now, I'm going to give that to you at the end, okay? There's a scale of damages, right? Just a little bit more sophistication around that. I think there's a real chance to build an A-level assessment of that when I give you this last material, okay? So let's go through. Don't write this down. Just anything you don't have a certain of, ask me, and I'll give you a written copy of this, right? We've talked about the purpose of negligence, compensate victims, and to deter members of society from unsafe behaviour. The opposite of that is, should a burden be placed on people for a behaviour? So this is a real question for Dan, right? If Dan's being silly, is it fair that all councils have that burden of assuming that adults are going to use children's equipment in a way that's not designed for? Very interesting thing. 3 things that have to be proven, right? A duty of care has to be owed, the duty of care has to be breached, and damages has to be caused. We're pretty familiar with that. Vicarious liability, we're now familiar with that as well. It means if someone is acting properly in the role as either an employee, or a contractor, right, the damage for negligence doesn't sit with them, it sits with whoever has employed them or contracted them. It sits with that person, provided they've done a reasonable job. Okay, and that's another discussion, John, that you could have got some more depth out of that last question. Maybe you looked at vicarious liability in a little bit more depth and made that argument as to the fact that they hadn't acted outside of their scope and they hadn't acted in a way that was unreasonable, and therefore there was no problems, concerns there. Okay, the duty of care. Here's another case that I think you can fit into a lot of things. Stevenson versus Donoghue, and this comes up with the Neighbour principle. It says, anyone who could be reasonably seen to be impacted by someone's acts or omissions is their neighbour, and that's who we own a duty of care to. Right? It's reasonably foreseeable that someone's going to come and use a park, therefore we owe a duty of care to them. You guys are in my class, it's clear I owe you a duty of care, I owe all the students at the school a duty of care, right? One of the more interesting things I ever do at my last school at Behaviour is we had a couple of big kangaroos that used to come into the ground and hop around, and they would get very distressed. The school was shaped as a sort of a square. They get very distressed when we were all changing classes, and you'd have these roos hopping around. Right? Did we owe a duty of care to the students in that situation? Absolutely. We had to think about how we could safely do that. We know kangaroos can be dangerous. Right? I've given you a little bit of a link to the Civil Liability Act 2003, Section 9. A duty of care is owed if the risk is foreseeable and there is proximity between the parties.
Is the proximity just closeness?
Closeness, it is. And this might be one of those things that you use to expand your use of legislation a little bit.
Oh, wait,
Okay, I am going to give you those notes. I don't think I can wait too long, right? I'm going to have to, just so we get everything finished.
Can I ask a question about proximity?
Yeah.
With the duty of care, how do you, I'm confused about proximity. I thought proximity was under damages.
Under damages is about causality. Has this incident definitely led to the outcomes and the damages, right? Proximity is saying, is there someone who's close? Is it reasonably foreseeable that you're close enough to me that you're going to be damaged by something I do or don't do? So proximity is a duty of care owed. It's also saying, is there a clear link between the event and the damages, right? The causality of what's happened
so
there.
that would be under duty, be like, there is a link because Dan was using this link.
Yeah. So for example, while I might have a duty of care for any of you guys here, my duty of care for students in a different school, even though they're just across the way, is very different in that in a situation. Let's say we had a plane seem to crash down there. I would be entirely concerned about you guys because of proximity. I'm not that concerned because I don't teach them. Obviously, deeply concerned about them as people, but because I'm not concerned about their safety in this situation.
Every class for themselves, man.
That's right, in that situation. Now, reasonable person would have taken precautions depending on, you know these things, seriousness of the harm, the probability that the harm would occur, how practical it is to take precautions, and the social value of the activity. They're the four things for the breach of duty of care, very much the same. And the same thing here for damages. This is the test, the but-for test. Did the harm occur but for the defendant?
I use that.
Okay, yeah, and that's the question. Did the harm occur but for? That's the equivalent of proximity in damages. Was it just that these two things were so close that the harm occurred? Okay, so the but-for test. Contributory negligence. If a person is partly to fault for the damage, the court can decide what percentage of the loss they've contributed. So they can look at that and say, and they can make that assessment up to 100%. So some of you might have said, some of you could have argued that there was a duty of care, the duty of care was breached, and there were damaged, and then decided that Dan was 100% responsible because he was using the swings in a way that was not appropriate. And I think that would probably be a better conclusion than to say there was no breach of the duty of care. I think there was a breach of the duty of care because I think they should have had seats that had that capacity. However, I think it's easy to argue that he was 100% responsible for his damages. Okay, I think that's perhaps a more sophisticated way of arguing that. Okay. Now, a judge has to calculate how severe a plaintiff's general damage are on a scale of 1 to 100. And as an exciting adventure, we're going to have a look at this. And this is the last thing we have to know before the exam. The last thing we have to know. And you do not have to know this. This is, I think, this brings in some A-level sophistication around your answer. Right, plus it's maths, so it's going to be fun. So let's have a look at this. Here it is. This is the calculation of general damages that they refer to. It's updated each year, it's increased by inflation. Because if they just said when it started, in 2002 or whenever it was $250,000 and it wouldn't change, pretty soon, sometime in the future, you guys will earn an income of $250,000 a year. It's going to be a while away. So what you have to do is you have to keep increasing those damages year after year to keep up with the costs of goods and services. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to work that out. That's just Mr. Bowden saying they're just fixing it up in whatever it was. Okay, so the maximum level of damage. So let's have a look at this scale and how it works, right? The maximum level of damages now is up to is precisely up to $341,000. That's from the 1st of July. That's the maximum level you can be awarded for pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment. That's separate from the economic ones like loss of income. Okay, this is just the pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment. And right at the top of the scale, the $341,050, that's someone who is unable to move, serious brain damage. That is a very, very serious incident. Down the side, you'll see, or it actually runs in the middle. If I can try and use my cursor, see the first range, you assess it between 0 and 5. The judge assesses things on a 100-point scale. So if you've got 0 and 5, that's a fairly minor incident. What happens is you assess whatever you've assessed at and you multiply it by $1,360 per point. Things increase as the scale goes up. So right at the top, you're multiplying whatever's been assessed at by 4,770. What I suggest to you is this. You don't try and remember this table. That will not work. Right, that's outrageous. Don't try and memorise the table. What I would suggest is that you know that there is a 100-point table and that the average value of 1 point is around $3,400. Okay, because 100 points adds up to $340,000. If you can put that in, and you can then say, and I say in my justification in my letter, rather than just saying I think it's a minor issue which is worth $50,000, I say, okay, on a 100-point scale, it's really only going to be worth 10 points. It's a fairly minor issue. There's only one activity that you can't be involved in for the rest of your life, and even though it's something you enjoy, it's going to have an impact on you. It's only going to be worth 10 points, and that works out at $3,400 a point for $34,000. If you can explain and use that point system, that's great. You might be more sophisticated and you might say, well, early on the point value is even less than that, and you might do a calculation from that. I don't mind how you do that. But if that would be an A-level piece of justification, that you've gone to this scale, you know the name of the scale, you know the rough up-to-date value, and it works like so. Who kind of understands that scale? No. Yeah, a few of you do. Okay, let's go through the scale again. It's called the calculation of general damages. So these are the damages for things like pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment. This is not the scale for loss of income because we can work out the loss of income exactly. We know what the loss of income is. This is now saying how much you can claim for pain and suffering. Let's say playing soccer this weekend, a girl gets hurt. She breaks her leg and it takes 6 months to recover and she can never play soccer again. So what are we going to assess that on? If we look at this 100-point scale, do we think it's up around 100 points, which is equivalent to a brain injury or quadriplegia, not being able to walk again? So no, we're saying no, it's not there. It might be more around the 20 points. It might go a little bit higher if she's going to limp for the rest of her life. You'd say 50 points? Okay. If she's going to limp for the rest of her life, she can't play soccer, she's had the pain of a broken leg, maybe you argue 50 points. Okay. It's not going to be a precise science. But you then say, okay, well, each point is worth around $3,000. So you might look to sue $150,000. Sorry?
I don't get how you know that each point.
Okay. What happens with the points is early on the points are worth a little bit less. They're worth $1,500. By the end, they're worth more. But on average, they're worth just over $3,000 each. Okay. So as the injury becomes more serious, each point has a higher value. Right.
Where does it say the value?
Okay, what it says here, see where it says the multiplier?
Yeah.
That means the first 5 points are worth 1,360. The next 5 points are worth 1,640. The next 5 points are worth 1,910. All the way down to the end where the points are worth $4,770. So that's where the points come from. I would say it's unreasonable to expect you to learn them. I would be learning something like the average point value is $3,400. Maybe make a comment about the fact that earlier points have less value, more extreme points have higher value. Okay. This is an A-level bit of thinking to be able to use this. John.
So would 100 points, what would that be? Like?
Okay, right down here, this is the maximum. 100 points, the maximum you can claim is now $341,050. That's the maximum you can claim for the most serious thing. $341,050.
What would have to happen to you in a negligence case for you to be awarded 100 points?
To use complete use of your arms and legs, to have a brain injury that significantly affects your ability to interact on a day-to-day basis. You're talking about massive loss of ability.
Attention, Reverend Ben Webb, please contact reception. Thank you.
So that's how the scale works. So Leanne, if I estimated that someone had an injury of 20 points, right, so a fairly minor injury, let's say for a year they couldn't play the sport that they really enjoyed, are you happy saying, okay, that's 20 points, each point has an average value of, say, $3,000, so that means that the damage is of $60,000 for pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment? Are you happy with that calculation? Yeah. So that's what we're doing. We're saying how many points on a 100-point scale do we think that we've got, and then what are the value of the points? You can't in an exam be expected to remember this. Maybe remember that the average is around 3,000 or 3,400, and to be more sophisticated, they start smaller earlier and they become bigger later on. Josie?
Would it be better to remember that if you only awarded them 5 points, you did 5,000, and then if you awarded them 100, you did 5,000, and then just anywhere in between is 3?
Yeah, if you could, you would. They're thousands. There's 1,000 and 5,000.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could. If you remember that, that'd be great. I wouldn't be that worried. What I would be thinking, what I think would be A-level memory is just that the average is 3,400. They're actually, interestingly, just as a way of remembering, they start off at about very close to half that average, don't they? 1,360, 1,700, and they finish at close to 50% above that average. Okay, so that's kind of the range that they go into. So 50% below and 50% above, 3,400.
Why have they kept the maximum at 3,000?
Yeah, obviously, this was one of the situations. It's a very interesting discussion to have, and we've only got a minute, but it was the concern about the size of payouts that people were getting. And so there are these two caps. This cap on this 100-point scale, and then the cap for income, lost earnings, is capped at 3 times the average income per year for exactly the same reason. Just to make this manageable, they wanted to get away from people suing for $10 million and $20 million and $30 million and it being unsustainable. Because one of the things that comes with negligence is insurance. And so if people can sue for $10 million and $20 million and $30 million, everyone's insurance goes through the roof. We all pay more for basic things, and then less people have insurance. And so more people who are involved in negligence, you can sue someone for as much as you want, but unless they have those assets, you're not going to get it if you don't have insurance. It was just trying to cap those payouts. Anyone else have any questions? What do you need from me? I will shoot through the link to this video. This is going to be a fairly long one. Lara. And I'll send you the slides that we just showed you. Okay. And just email me anything. It's not till Wednesday, the exam, so you've got plenty of time. How many people think, having seen a practice exam, let's just go through the scale. How many people are quite comfortable, quite confident? Okay, so quite confident, reasonably... No, the whole thing, the assessment task. Quite confident, reasonably confident, somewhat confident, and not at all confident. How many people are quite confident? Reasonably confident? Somewhat confident? Not at all confident? Okay, Josie. So feel free to send through some answers. It'll be somewhat similar to the question you've done. Okay, have a great day, guys.
We have this next.
Yep.